Alright, so this video is going to help you with the first type of chi-squared test, which is called the goodness of fit test. And we're going to learn about three different types of chi-squared tests throughout this chapter, and this will be the first of the three. Alright, so the three types of chi-squared tests are as follows. This video's type of test is called the goodness of fit test, and its goal is to test to see if the observed distribution varies from the expected distribution. Now, with the goodness of fit test, we start with our null hypothesis as the distribution of data varies the way we expect it to. And our alternative is that the distribution varies differently in some way than what we expected. Now, these hypotheses are going to need to be adapted to the context of the problem, so notice that these are stated very generally, but we will take a look at a couple examples to kind of help with the context aspect of it. The second type of test, which we will discuss next, would be the test of homogeneity of populations, so also known as the test of homogeneity. And its goal is to determine whether or not two or more subgroups of a population share the same distribution of a single categorical variable. Now we're going to start by assuming our null hypothesis that the two or more subgroups have the same distribution, and our alternative is going to be that they differ in some way from each other. And the last type of chi-squared test is called the test of association, and its goal is to determine whether or not two categorical variables are associated with one another in the population. Our null is going to be that we're going to start by assuming there is no association between the two variables, and our alternative is going to be that there is some association between the variables. Now notice with this alternative I do not state the direction of the association, I just state that there is some association. Alright, so if we go back to previous chapters, we could do a single proportion inference procedure. So for example, suppose you open a 1.69 ounce bag of M&Ms, that's a regular size bag of M&Ms, and only 2 out of the 56 are red. Well, according to the Mars Chocolate Company, 13% of all plain M&Ms should be red, and that in your sample of size 56, the proportion is only 3.6%. Now, if red is your favorite color, you might be feeling a little cheated at this point. Now, from previous chapters, specifically chapter 12, we could do a proportion Z test to test whether or not this is a true statement. In fact, you actually have done a very similar problem like this, but with yellow M&M proportion. And we'd be looking at the proportion of red M&Ms in this case. So we could do this. Now, my question is, what if we wanted to test each color to see if each proportion was correct according to the company? Now, we can do this based off of chapter 12. All we would have to do is conduct a separate significance test for each of the colors. So red, orange, yellow, brown, blue, and green. Now, we could do that for each color of M&Ms. However, that would make us do 6 separate significance tests, which could get a little tedious. Now, what we would like to do is we would like to somehow, using chi-squared, be able to compare the entire distribution of colors rather than each one separately. And that's why we're looking at the chi-squared goodness of fit. We're going to be able to test to see if the observed sample distribution is significantly different than what it should have been according to our hypothesis. So what it should have been according to the chocolate company. Alright, so I'm going to show you kind of a little example where I break it down in terms of the specifics of a goodness of fit test, and then I will show you a complete problem step by step of what a chi-squared would include of. Tomorrow we're actually going to do some group work in terms of different groups having different problems, and you're going to end up doing a presentation as to your problem and the findings that you came across. So, this study had looked at cell phones and driving versus accidents, and we're interested in if car accidents are equally likely throughout the week or if there is a difference depending on the day, so Monday through Sunday. Alright, now remember, a goodness of fit test, I started by assuming the distribution varies in the way we expect it to, and our alternative is that it varies differently from what we expected to. So in this case, my null is going to be that I'm going to start by assuming that accidents are equally likely on each of the 7 days of the week. And my alternative is going to be that they vary in some way, that they're not all the same number of accidents. Now I could write this in terms of proportions. For example, I could write it in terms of the proportion of Sunday accidents, proportion of Monday accidents, that they are all equal to each other. In fact, they should all be equal to 1/7 of the total accidents. And my alternative is going to be that these proportions differ in some way. Now this is the actual observed data, so this is what we're going to compare to my null hypothesis. My null says they should all be equally likely. I'm going to compare my observed data to see if that does in fact seem reasonable. Now, a really important part of chi-square tests is finding your expected counts. Now, the expected counts are what would you expect to get if your null was correct. Now, there were 699 total accidents in our data set. Now, remember, our null was that they were all, each day of the week was equally likely to have the same number of accidents. So, if my observed counts are as provided, but there's 699 total accidents, my expected counts would be that 699 accidents broken up into 1/7 on each day. So 99.857 accidents on Sunday, 99.857 accidents on Monday, etc. Notice my expected counts do not have to be whole numbers. Very, very important there. Decimals are okay. Now to actually find our chi-squared statistic, we're going to use this little formula. This is called our chi-squared statistics, which is found by our observed value minus expected value squared divided by the expected value. Now this measures how big of the differences that we actually see. So how different are our observed values from our expected values? So you get a very high chi-squared. It means that you have very different observed values from what you should have seen with your null. All right, now in this case I have my observed and my expected listed. I can actually find my chi-squared statistic by finding each different component. Now each of these values is called a component. It's that specific distance, how different the observed and expected counts are for that specific day. Now notice Monday has a much smaller component than Sunday, because notice Monday's number of accidents compared to what I expected to see is much closer than Sunday's observed number of accidents to what it should have been. So the component tells you how different your observed and expected counts are. So I can do this for each day of the week. Now notice in my formula it says sigma. So sigma means I find each of these components and I add them up, which in this case would give me 208.84. Now, to do any type of hypothesis test, we need a p-value to make a decision. Now, to find our p-value, we need to make sure we check our conditions. Now, the nice thing is our conditions for a chi-squared is very simple. Okay, two things need to happen. All our expected counts need to be at least 1, and our at least 80% of our expected counts need to be more than 5. Now, we already found our chi-squared statistic. We could find our p-value actually two different ways, either on table D as in dog, or on our calculator. Now, this is what table D looks like in your textbook. All right, now notice I have my degrees of freedom on this left-hand column. I have my p-values along the top of the table. And these are all my chi-squared statistics within the table. So in this specific case, I got a chi-squared of 208.84. And my degrees of freedom is 6 because I had 7 days of the week. Minus 1 gives me 6. Now if I go across this row until I find my chi-squared statistic, you'll notice I get really, really far over here to find my chi-squared statistic. So similarly to table C, I go up to find my p-value, and that is how you use table D. Right? Now, I'm going to show you a full-length example. So this is exactly what I'm going to be expecting to see tomorrow when you guys are working on your group problems. So this problem has to do with fruit flies. Now this is called a Punnett square, just like you used in biology. And it says if we mate two fruit flies with the following possible outcomes. So red-eyed is the dominant gene, white-eyed is the recessive gene. Straight wing is the dominant wing type, and curly wing is the recessive wing type. So these are all my possible combinations of fruit flies. All right, so now it says of 200 offspring, we observed 99 to have red eyes and straight wings, 42 to have red eyes, curly wings, 49 had white eyes, straight wings, and 10 had white eyes, curly wings. Do these data differ significantly from what was predicted by the Punnett square? Now this is all my possible outcomes. So I need to figure out of these 200, how many should I have seen or would I have expected to see with red eyes and straight wings? Now notice on our Punnett square, okay, for example, if we look right here, notice I have a dominant gene for red eyes and a dominant gene for curly wings. So this would represent a red-eye curly wing fruit fly. Now notice in this case down here, I have two recessive genes for eye color, which would mean that's a white eye fruit fly. And then I have a dominant curly wing, so that would be a white-eyed curly winged fruit fly. Now notice there's 16 possible outcomes. 9 of them go for red eye straight wing. 3 of them are red eye curly wing. 3 of them are white eye straight wing. And 1 of them is white eye curly wing. Okay, so notice out of the 16, I should get 56.25% as red eye straight wing. I should get 18.75% as red eye curly wing, etc. Now remember, I'm going to start by making my null hypothesis that the distribution is what I should have seen, and my alternative is that my distribution does in fact differ from what I should have seen. So I'm going to start by assuming that these proportions are in fact what I expected based off of the Punnett square. And my alternative is going to be that at least one of these proportions is incorrect. Now my conditions, notice all of my expected counts out of my sample of 200 flies, so my sample was 200, 56.25% of them should have been red eye straight wing. So I would have expected to see 112.5 of these 200 fruit flies. I would have expected to see that many of them with red eye straight wings. I would have expected to see 37.5 fruit flies out of the 200 to be red eye curly wings, 37.5 to be white eye straight wings, and 12.5 to be white eye curly wings. Notice all my expected counts are greater than 5, therefore I know they're all at least 1. So my conditions are met. Now to find my calculations, I need my observed and my expected counts. So I'm going to find the difference in the observed and expected counts squared over the expected for each type of fruit fly. Now, once you have those written out, it's very easy to actually add them up. I recommend doing each part separately and adding them up at the end. I think that's the easiest way to go about it. Now my degrees of freedom in this case is 3 because I have 4 possibilities minus 1 gives me 3. And if I go on table D and I look for this chi-squared statistic of 6.18 with a degree of freedom of 3, you'll notice that my p-value falls between 10 and 15%. Now if I do a chi-squared test on my calculator, I will get a p-value of 10.29%, which makes sense with table D. So my interpretation, just like always, I can make my decision. With my p-value of 10.29%, that indicates the probability of obtaining a sample of 200 fruit flies in which the proportions differ from the hypothesized values by at least as much as the ones in our sample is over a 10% chance, assuming that the distribution that we expected to see was true. So notice that I do not have sufficient evidence to reject the biologist's predicted distribution. All right, hope that helped with the goodness of fit and the Inference Toolbox to complete one. Once again, you're going to be doing some group work tomorrow to carry out some goodness of fit tests, and you will be ready to present them to the class. So please let me know if you have any questions or concerns, and I'd be happy to get back to you.